opportunity to be here today.
More than 90% of all internet searches take place on Google or its subsidiary YouTube, and they are curating what we see. Google has long faced criticism for manipulating search results to censor conservatives. Conservative individuals and organizations have had their pro-Trump content tagged as hate speech or had their content reduced in search results. So what are you going to improve that situation?
Congressman, thanks for the question. If I may, some of the studies you mentioned, we have investigated those. There are other studies which have looked at it. We have found issues with the methodology and the sample size and so on. But let me step back and say, providing users with high quality, accurate, and trusted information is sacrosanct to us. It's what our principles are, and our business interests, our natural long-term incentives are aligned with that. We want to serve users everywhere, and we need to earn their trust in doing so.
Ileana Murillo is Google's head of multicultural marketing. Does Ms. Murillo do good work?
I'm not directly familiar with her work, but she's an employee of Google, and we are proud of our employees.
Your head of multicultural marketing said you were pushing to get out the Latino vote, paying for a ride to the polls for the Latino vote only in key states, and you're saying that's not accurate.
Yes, that's right. We haven't found any evidence to substantiate any.
So she just made it up out of thin air the day after the election and wrote this email to your top executives, and it's not true?
Congressman, I'm happy to follow up, but I think the employees today do their own activities.
We don't want the follow-up. I want the real answers right here in this committee.
As I said earlier, we have looked into it. We didn't find
Did you push to get out the key vote? And I would say the two most populous states for Latinos would be California and Texas. Did you push to get out the Latino vote and pay for people to go to the polls in California and Texas?
We as a company didn't have any effort to push out votes for any particular demographic. That would be against our principles. We participate in the civic process in a nonpartisan way, and we think it's really important we do it that way.
I have an iPhone, and if I move from here and go over there and sit with my Democrat friends, which will make them real nervous, does Google track my movement? Does Google, through this phone, know that I have moved here and moved over to the left? It's either yes or no.
Not by default. There may be a Google service which you've opted in to use, and if...
So Google knows that I am moving over there. It's not a trick question. You know, you make $100 million a year, you ought to be able to answer that question. Does Google know through this phone that I am moving over there and sit next to Mr. Johnson, which would make him real nervous? It's his question. It's yes or no.
I wouldn't be able to answer without looking at...
you can't say yes or no.
Without knowing more details, sir.
I have a concern concerning China. In 2010, Google left the Chinese marketplace due to concerns over hacking attacks, censorship, and how the Chinese government was possibly gaining access to data. I'm interested in what has changed since 2010 and how working with the Chinese government to censor research results are part of Google's core values. Do you understand my question?
Congressman, right now there are no plans for us to launch a search product in China. We are, in general, always looking to see how best it's part of our core mission and our principles to try hard to provide users with information. We always have evidence based on every country we have operated in. Us reaching out and giving users to more information has a very positive impact, and we feel that calling. But right now, there are no plans to launch in China. To the extent that we ever approach a decision like that, I will be fully transparent, including with policymakers here, and engage and consult widely.
So anticipating what took place in 2016 happening again, and this is specifically regarding what Russia did to foment racial tensions in the United States, and wanting to know how you are responding to that, where they called for, fake protest, either to get African Americans to turn out to protest something that was fake, or to have white supremacists be ginned up to attack communities of color. So specifically, what is Google doing to respond to that?
We mainly saw, with respect to Russia, limited improper activity on our ad platforms. But in general, we are not a social networking company across the products we do. It's an area we haven't done well as a company. So we typically are in connecting groups of people, and that's not how Google mainly works today. And so we haven't seen that kind of activity.
They're not a social networking platform, and they own YouTube.
On our platforms, but we are vigilant and and happy to share any findings which come through as we look into it more.
The operating environment in China has deteriorated with respect to surveillance, censorship, and the like since Google first made the decision in 2010 to leave. So I want to ask very specifically, are any employees currently having product meetings on this Chinese project? And if not, when did those end?
We have undertaken an internal effort, but right now there are no plans to launch a search service in China, as I said earlier.
What does it mean we have taken an internal effort?
Are there any current discussions with any member of the Chinese government on launching this app?
Currently, we are not in discussions around launching a search product in China.
Are there any current discussions with members of the Chinese government about this?
This effort currently is an internal effort, and I'm happy to consult as well as be transparent to the extent we take steps towards launching a product in China.
What does an internal effort mean? And what he just said right there.
Consult as well as be transparent to the extent we take steps towards launching a product in China.
And steps towards launching a product in China.
Who at Google is leading the Dragonfly effort?
It's our efforts around building search. It's undertaken by our search teams, but these are distributed efforts. It's a limited effort internally currently.
Will you, Mr. Pichai, rule out launching a tool for surveillance and censorship in China while you are CEO of Google?
Congressman, I commit to engaging. One of the things which is important to us as a company, we have a stated mission of providing users with information. And so we think it's in our duty to explore possibilities to give users access to information. And, I have that commitment, but, as I said earlier on this, we'll be very thoughtful and we will engage widely as we make progress.
This is now the fourth hearing in a series of ridiculous hearings on the free speech of internet companies. A significant portion of this hearing was a waste of time because the First Amendment protects private individuals and corporations' free speech rights. So I'm going to search for Congressman Steve King. I'm going to hit the News tab. First article that pops up is from ABC News. It says, Steve King's racist immigration talk prompts calls for congressional censure. That's a negative article. But you don't have a group of people at Google sitting there thinking and trying to modify search results. Every time Steve King comes up, a negative article appears. That's not what's happening, right?
We always operate for any query with the same set of principles. We are trying to reflect what is currently, if it is newsworthy, what is currently being discussed about that phrase.
Thank you. So let me just conclude here by stating the obvious. If you want positive search results, do positive things. If you don't want negative search results, don't do negative things. And to some of my colleagues across the aisle, if you're getting bad press articles and bad search results, don't blame Google or Facebook or Twitter. Consider blaming yourself.
See how much Mr. Liu has invested in Google. That would be curious.
Did Google design a prototype for a search engine that could be used in China to censor content?
Congressman, we have undertaken an internal effort.
Did you create a prototype? There was a report in the
That would be yes.
Intercept that says a prototype for the censored search engine was designed.
We have developed and explored what search could look like if it were to be launched in a country like China, and that's what we explored. And
how many months was that project ongoing?
We've had the project underway for a while, and there have been other projects which we have undertaken for a while, and we have never launched them too. So we are constantly exploring.
How many people were working on it?
The estimates, the number of engineers on the project have varied over time. At one point, we have had over 100 people working on it. It's my
Over 100 people working on a way to censorship China in their search results. And look at all the non-answers. Remember this, YouTube. Google owns you.
understanding.
Who makes the judgment calls regarding content moderation at Google?
Chairman, it depends on the area. So, for example, if it's YouTube, we have, very clear teams which are responsible for YouTube content policies. And
Are they identified? Is it possible for a customer to write to them and say, hey, here's a concern I have?
we give clear channels for content creators to, to raise concerns back, and we have clear avenues. And we also have had people who are responsible for these platforms, including content moderation, appear here, and I think they've consulted widely here too.
There's a clear path for you to communicate to someone at YouTube if you have a problem. Testify before the Senate.
Thank you. Well, you've gone for about 3.5 hours, and it's about what we predicted, isn't it, yesterday when we talked? So we...
Through several questions because it's been discussed a lot about what you collect and what you don't collect. So the next few questions will be yes, no questions. I'm not trying to trick you here. It's simply what do you collect and how do you collect it, okay? In dealing with Google, do you or do you not collect identifiers like name, age, and address? Yes or no?
If you're creating an account, yes, and using an account, yes.
Yes. Specific search histories when a person types something into a search bar.
If you have search history turned on, yes.
Device identifiers like IP address or IMEI.
Depending on the situation, we could be collecting it, yes.
GPS signals, Wi-Fi signals,
Tracking your IP.
Bluetooth beacons.
Would depend on the specifics, but there may be situations, yes.
The GPS, yes.
Yes, if you have
And
location.
voice and conversations when using Google Voice products.
We give an option to turn on or off. And
But if a person didn't know it, voice and conversations when using Google Voice products. Yes.
We only record when they initiated with OK Google and then say the terms after.
Contents of emails and Google documents.
They have to be listening for your voice in order to detect that you say OK Google at all times. They have to be listening for it.
We store the data, but we don't read or look at your Gmail.
But you have access to them.
As a company, we have access to them, yes.
So you could. Saying you don't or don't, I'm not asking do you or don't. I'm saying you could, though there is a possibility.
We have clear established policies on how we would do that data.
And their privacy policies, speaking of that, has changed 28 times, including 8 times since January of 2016. So I think the policies, and this is why I'm asking these questions. Is there any type or origin of data which Google would refuse to collect that is not already prohibited by laws like COPA or HIPAA?
And there are many categories of information today. We are particular about anything to do with health data.
And those are covered under those. Anything that you would not collect outside of the 2 that I named, which are generally accepted as things you cannot collect.
There are many things which we don't collect. For example, we don't collect, you could have a product like Google Home. We won't collect conversations unless you specifically ask us to. So you ask a question. And so we definitely are very careful and minimize the data we need to provide the service back to our users.
I'm glad you mentioned data minimization. We'll get to that in just a second. How long do you keep the data that you have captured?
Today we give you the choice of whether you want to store the data or not. But if you store the data, from the time you turn it on, we store it for you.
Okay, well, let me ask a question here. For all this has been discussed, age identifiers, search histories, all these things. And how many would you say, let me just say, you've made an interesting question. How many people actually understand that they can actually cut this off?
We remind people, and every day 20 million people come and make changes in these settings. We see robust activity.
When you control 95% of searches, you control this in a very large way. I would say the vast majority, not the most sophisticated, not the ones in a certain age demographic, are not as familiar with this as, say, some who work in the industry or at least around the industry. Would that not be a fair statement?
If you could repeat that, Congressman, sorry.
I'll get back to it. Earlier it was said that identifiers such as age, name, and address are treated differently. If that is true, how are you treating them differently? And is the same data collection process still done? How is it treated differently than maybe some of these others that we have spoke of that came, I think, from Mr. Deutsch's discussions, such as locators and things like that?
We offer different controls for that. So for example, for location, we give specific controls. For your voice activity, we give specific controls. We are trying to meet users' expectations. And so for example, some people may want their search history to be available, but they don't want YouTube history to be recorded. So we give those choices to our users.
One of the general dynamics of most of this tech industry and those who collect data is data minimization. You brought it up just a few minutes ago. The issue that I have, and it was in March of this year, a security researcher actually downloaded his, quote, Google Takeout. This is probably there. It was 5.5 gigabyte. This is not just a few names and addresses and where you went. Why, number one, does Google need all this information? We can answer that in the fact that 86% of your revenue comes from advertising, so we know you manipulate the data in some ways. However, can you explain what you do to minimize this data, which is generally an accepted standard practice among those who collect data?
Our goal is, but we are providing, for example, if we are providing you a service like Gmail, which we have done for 15 years, that data, we need to store it for our users, so they expect us to. So we are trying hard to match users' expectations. We don't need our data for advertising, as I said earlier, most of it comes from just the keywords you type. And so, we need minimal data to do advertising. We give you options to turn ads personalization off. We store most of the data we do today to help give users the experience they want, and that's what we're trying to do.
I'm going to go back to where I started. Perception is reality. The amount of data being collected here, the how it is being used, how you monetize, the one ad, basically the flow of information that you have, and the monetization of that is a concern. I think the perception of how it is used and from what side of the aisle is something that this committee, I think, will take up and continue to process. But I think when most people deal with this, what I said earlier, I'm not sure that in the broad scope of things, simply clicking yes, especially in a society today in which some of these things, and especially that was talked about mobile, which we've not delved into even further, is going to open up a much larger situation in which is.
Have you ever launched an investigation into whether political bias is impacting the consumer experience?
Congressman, we do, to the extent there are concerns, we look into them, and it's.
No, have you expressly launched an investigation into political bias of your employees?
On our employees, you said?
Yes.
To the extent, we always take any allegations around code of conduct across every issue seriously, and we look into them.
You said to me yesterday that as it relates to political bias, you haven't launched those investigations because there are so many redundancies and there is so much peer review that would not be possible. Is that still your testimony today?
Congressman, yes, it's the way our processes work. If you need to make a change in our algorithms, there are several steps in the process, including launch committees and user testing and our rater guideline evaluation.
But at your company, your employees can get together and chat in groups, right? Google groups?
Yes, they can.
And one of those groups is the civil rights group, right?
We have many employee resource groups on which they can participate in conversations, yes.
Have you ever looked into the conversation into the resist group?
Congressman, no.
Is that a surprise to you that there's a resist group?
I'm not aware whether such a group exists or not.
If there was a resist group, would that be the type of thing that you would want to look into?
We have clear policies around how our products are built. And
no, but if there's a resist, you know that the resist movement is a movement built to resist the agenda of President Trump. If there's a resist group within your company where groups of employees, not one, are getting together within that group to engage in discourse on company time with company infrastructure, does that strike you as the type of thing you would want to investigate?
Congressman, I'm not aware of any such group. None like that has been brought to my attention, and happy to follow up to and understand the concern better.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a document from what purports to be Google employee Miles Borens, which is opposed to the Google group Resist.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'm also reading now from the discussion that occurred over Breitbart and Google Ads, and I'm quoting from one of your employees who purportedly posted, anyone want to hold their nose and look through Breitbart.com for hate speech? Why would someone need to hold their nose to do that work?
Congressman, today we have 90,000 employees, and they communicate in forums. As a company, we have allowed freedom of expression, and we don't stand or condone comments expressed in these things. We are very clear about our policies as to how we build our products, and we serve our publishers that way.
Well, if you haven't launched an investigation into any of your employees, because it would take a group of employees to engage in improper conduct, and if those groups of employees are engaging in discussion on your platform, and if one of those platform groups is Resist, and if on that Resist movement site or any other sites in your platform, there's discussion of suppressing conservative speech, why would that not be something that you would launch an internal investigation in, publish the reports, sanction those employees that may or may not be engaged in improper conduct, so that we can all have greater comfort in the user experience?
Congressman, first of all, I want to assure you, we have checks and balances so that employees, and we not just on this issue, across any issue, we protect the sanctity of our systems, our product development process, and we would do that.
How can I have confidence that you're protecting the sanctity of your system when you don't even know that your employees are getting together on your own company's infrastructure to talk about political activity?
In general, we always assume our systems are designed. We assume there could be bad intent. So we've designed from first principles because, for security reasons, both externally and internally, at any given moment, we assume that somebody may be acting in bad faith, and that's how we have designed our systems with all the protections in place. We need to do that for our security of our systems, and it's a first principles approach.
So if your assumption is that people can act in bad faith, Why then have you not launched an investigation into the communications that seem to indicate a desire to suppress conservative political movements and conservative voices?
Well, if there are allegations around, discussions which are specific with the intent of manipulating our products, we would conduct an investigation.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. The Wall Street Journal reported that your workers were discussing tweaking search terms to frame the discussion over the travel ban. Did you perform an investigation into that allegation?
We looked into it. There was no attempt at, anything to influence our products. There are at times during important news events, for example, during events like hurricanes, etc., we have a set of tools, crisis response tools. During the travel ban, even the Department of Homeland Security was looking to put out information because there was some confusion around the event. So there was some discussion around things like that too. And so,
well, I would strongly suggest that one of the crisis response tools that you use is in an investigation into the discourse of your employees on resisting the Trump presidency, resisting the Trump agenda, and then smothering some of the conservative outlets that seek to amplify that content. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Thank
you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, we want to thank you for appearing today and for taking the time to answer and meet with us individually, answer our questions. I think you and I both agree it's important for your company and for the people for us to have this public hearing and to get all this information on the record, so to speak. So as we discussed in my office yesterday, my conservative colleagues and I are fierce advocates of limited government. And we're also committed guardians of free speech and the free marketplace of ideas. We do not want to impose burdensome government regulations on your industry. However, we do believe we have an affirmative duty to ensure that the engine that processes as much, as we said today, 90% of all internet searches is never used to unfairly censor conservative viewpoints or suppress political views. Your challenge today, and in the days ahead, is to convince the members of this body that Google and your industry peers will implement your own sufficient safeguards and solutions to this problem so that the government doesn't have to intervene. Here's a question. In previous hearings and discussions, Google has described the Trusted Flagger program as a source for recommending content be removed from your platform. Recently, Google released a transparency report on content removal, which revealed that out of the 7.7 million automated flagging removals from your platform, YouTube, around 70% of that content was removed before it had received any views from the public. Here's the question. How does Google ensure that content removed in the automated process is not merely because of philosophical or political differences?
Congressman, it's an important question. As you said, YouTube is committed to being a platform for freedom of expression, and we go to great lengths to do that. We only handle videos in the areas of clearly defined policies we have. We do have automated systems, but we assess it, we later spot check it to make sure the system is working as intended. We respond to feedback. As content creators, you can appeal if you think something was removed erroneously. But it's really important to us that we provide a platform for freedom of expression, but enforce the rules of the road on areas where we have said, but we are very transparent about the areas and the clear policies with which we do those things.
You've spoken a lot today about objectivity. That's the goal. We applaud and appreciate that. As you know, Alphabet's incubator Jigsaw has introduced Perspective. It's a tool that uses machine learning to filter online discussions for, quote, toxicity, unquote. This to me raises issues of how Google's parent company is using machine learning to filter speech that is viewed as unproductive, such as ad hominem attacks or offensive language or the like. When creating a tool like Perspective, what steps is Google taking to protect conservative viewpoints from being considered toxic by subjective reviewers as the program progresses?
Congressman, Perspective, provided by one of our sister organizations, Jigsaw, it's a platform for publishers to use. So the publishers get to define what they want acceptable or not, and then that's what the tool provides for them. But I think your point is valid. I mean, we don't want to be in the position of just editorializing publisher content, and we are just providing a tool for publishers to better drive the content on their platforms.
You mentioned the appeals process if a content provider has their material flagged. How quick does that appeals process work? In other words, what's the review period?
I think it varies. We prioritize areas which are sensitive. For example, areas like terrorism is something we prioritize very significantly and higher up in the queue. but we are ramping up our resources, and our goal is to do it as soon as possible. But sometimes it can be a matter of hours. If it's areas around copyright, we have implemented Content ID. We have a system by which we can automatically detect and respond right away back to copyright owners. So it's a constant work in progress.
I.e. algorithm, immediate way to do a copyright strikes, algorithm.
In the committee's last hearing with Google's Ms. Juniper Downs, we discussed this. I raised the case of the Alliance Defending Freedom's content being removed after being reported by a trusted flagger on YouTube. The flagging organization was the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has a kind of an infamous reputation for being, I would say, a radical left organization that opposes conservative viewpoints. What criteria does Google use when granting trusted flagger status to third parties such as the SPLC?
Today we first want to clarify one thing. Our trusted flaggers don't remove content. They can flag content for us to review, and we review flag content. It's mostly used by law enforcement, many nonprofit agencies in areas, important areas like child safety, terrorism, and so on. Southern Poverty Law Center is a trusted flagger. People can register. Last we checked, they've never flagged a single video on our platform. We have reached out to a wide variety of organizations.
Just said the Southern Poverty Law Center has never flagged in their videos.
Including conservative organizations. We would be happy to take your suggestions to add organizations as trusted flaggers.
Appreciate that. We need a little objectivity in the reviewers, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is now the fourth hearing.
I guess I would say that it looks like you guys have a policy of do no evil, right? Is that fair to say?
It's not our official policy, but it's a statement which has been communicated by us internally.
And other people have brought up the work that you may or may not be doing in China, and I want a clarification of that. Are you looking to expand in China and cooperate with the Chinese government on a platform release in China?
To the question, it's about search. Right now, we have no plans to launch search in China. We have always, over the years, explored how best we can continue to serve users in China, but that's what we're doing.
Are you doing anything with the data share with the Chinese government?
Today, we don't operate our services which involve user data, like Google Search or Gmail in China, and so no.
So you're telling me nothing at all then with China?
We do provide, for example, Android, which is an operating system. We work with partners around the world, and there are OEM manufacturers around the world, including in China.
So manufacturers, but beyond manufacturers, any other platform use?
We don't have any special agreements on user data today with the
Chinese government?
That's right.
Okay. Do you share the data that you collect on civilians with the United States federal government?
We comply with valid law enforcement request, and and with due process, we comply with valid law enforcement.
What's the extent of that?
We publish a transparency report in which we give insights into the law enforcement requests we have gotten and our and our compliance there.
The last question I have, real quickly. In May 2016, Google banned all ads by payday lenders, even though it invested in LendUp, which is effectively a payday lender. And it banned ads by competitors. Is that a normal practice?
Congressman, we undertook ad policies in that particular area because we saw evidence of misuse, and we had gotten a lot of feedback, and that's what we reacted to.
Did you ban your own LendUp app?
I don't think Google is involved. I think one of our sister companies is has an investment in
LendUp. Right.
I think that's my understanding.
Okay,
was it banned?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I can follow up. I'm not aware of the specifics there. Happy to follow up.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Pacheco, appreciate your being here. And I think most all of us agree on both sides. We applaud great work. For example, Steven Spielberg, despite politics, he's provided my family a lot of enjoyment and entertainment. You and your colleagues at Google have created an extraordinary vehicle for searching out things. It's fantastic. And as Mr. Liu, a friend across the aisle, was pointing out, you know, you've got government that's not supposed to interfere in people's civil rights, and then you've got a company, a corporation like Google. My problem is when the government gives its immunity from lawsuits over to a private corporation that's the head of that corporation doesn't even realize that there is political bias run amok in his company. And that's the problem. I don't want to see you overregulated. I don't want to see you regulated. I want to see others come up with brilliant ways, as you, Mr. Brim, and others did, to create something that makes life easier. But a good example, you have a trusted flagger, you'd indicated, called the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center really has stirred up more hate than about any other group I know. They stirred up one guy to the point that he went to the Family Research Council, and I know those people, and they're Christians. And they believe, and I believe, that Christianity is really more based on love than about any other religion in history. God so loved the world, he sent his son so loved the world, he gave his life. And yet they stirred up hate against the Family Research Center, and a guy goes in shooting. You have, let's see, June 18th of this year, Southern Poverty Law Center announced it had reached a settlement with Najib Nawaz and his organization, Gilliam, for falsely labeling them as anti-Muslim hate group. They were wrong. Now, you consider them a trusted flagger, yet they keep creating problems for people that are not haters. And in fact, they had to pay out $3.375 million. My problem is when you put your moniker on them, a trusted flagger, why aren't you paying $3.375 to Mr. Majid Nawaz? That's my problem. You trust people that have stirred up a lot of hate. And another good example, and you're so surrounded by liberality that hates conservatism, hates people that really love our Constitution and the freedoms it's afforded people like you, that you don't even recognize it. It's like a blind man not even knowing what light looks like because you're surrounded by darkness. But if you look, let's see, a good example, after President Trump won, your co-founder, Mr. Brin, said, quote, most people here are pretty upset and pretty sad. Now, a lot of us have seen the video. We saw how upset the top people at Google were. And for you to come in here and say there is no political bias in Google tells us you either are being dishonest, I don't want to think that, or you don't have a clue how politically biased Google is. Now, another example is Wikipedia. We do a search, and what comes up as right there is the knowledge panel on the right, and we hopefully will have a screenshot of that. We get Wikipedia. My chief of staff went on, she told me, every night for 2 weeks and put proper, honest information in with proper annotations, and Wikipedia's liberal editors around the world would knock it out every day and instead put up a bunch of garbage like Mark Levin has now been facing. Yet to you, they get a trusted spot. And when Wikipedia slanders or libels someone and you're the one that has trusted them above any other entity, you ought to be liable. You ought to be liable when the SPLC is liable. You ought to be liable when Wikipedia demeans and uses their political bias. And I hope and encourage you to look around and notice you run off conservatives, you embrace liberals, and it's time Google was actually not immune so that people can hold you accountable and get a little better objectivity. I see my time's run out. I yield back.
Policy, because I, quite frankly, don't understand all of it. And that is the policy states that Google's data collection applies when, quote, you use Google service. And so most consumers would think that means Google search or Google Maps. My question is, does the policy apply when a consumer contacts a double-click cookie? Are they then under that policy or not?
Today, our product there is called Google Ad Manager, and in general, when users interact with our services, we need their consent, and by law, we need to apply our privacy policy so that we can offer them the full protections we can and fulfill our obligations. And so, as part of that, I think if you're interacting with our ad services, we do get your consent for your privacy policy.
So that's written in the policy, and they have, okay. And then secondly, if a
Basically what he's saying, when you click on cookies in Google, they're tracking you.
consumer does not have a Google account, but they land on a web page that has Google adware again, is that consumer using a Google service under the privacy policy?
My understanding would be yes, if they are interacting, if they may be both subject to the privacy policy of the publisher or the application they are using, as well as the ad platforms that work on that product.
Okay, and then third and finally, your privacy policy says you collect voice and audio information when you use audio features. However, does this mean Google Assistant is recording our voices in conversations? How about when just using Google Voice? Is that actually being recorded?
Today, if you invoke Google Voice by either using the microphone or you say, "Okay, Google," and issue a command, we treat it like a search query and record that activity. But we have a separate setting in which, as a user, you can choose whether you want these stored or not. And so we give users the choice and the option.
See, when it gets to transparency, I think when you realize you have these active, where I'm clicking and giving that information and agreeing to it, I think people understand that information is going out and they're giving that permission. But it's these passive collection points, like Android and Chrome, where they're picking up that information and the user, I'm not sure the user actually knows that. And so, one of my questions is we're agreeing to a privacy policy, but we don't really know what information we're giving up because there are other groups that you are contracting with, Android and Chrome.
Quick follow-ups here. I don't think anybody asked who makes the judgment calls regarding content moderation at Google.
Chairman, it depends on the area. So, for example, if it's YouTube, we have, very clear teams which are responsible for YouTube content policies. And
are they identified? Is it possible for a customer to write to them and say, "Hey, here's a concern I have"?
We give clear channels for content creators to raise concerns back, and we have clear avenues. And we also have had people who are responsible for these platforms, including content moderation, appear here, and I think they've consulted widely here too.
Now, let me be clear. I do not believe big is necessarily bad. In fact, big is often a force for good. However, I want to address one particularly disturbing issue. Mr. Pichai, in October 2018, Google dropped out of the running for a Pentagon contract to complete the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, or JEDI contract, which was valued at more than $10 billion. Google's stated reason for removing itself from the bidding process is that the U.S. military's project did not align with Google's corporate values and principles. This is the same U.S. military that fights for our freedoms and stands as a force for good across the globe. These are the same soldiers, sailors, and airmen that sacrifice their lives to ensure you have the freedom to build your company and set your corporate policies without fear of government interference, unlike in communist China. I also find it very interesting that only months after making this decision to withdraw from the JEDI contract, Marine General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned the Senate Armed Forces Committee that the Chinese military was directly benefiting from Google's work. It made me wonder what values Google and communist Red China had in common. I asked myself, is it that the Chinese Communist Party imprisons Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, like it is shown on the chart behind me? Could it be that China forces slaves to work in sweatshops? Maybe they align on the design to suppress free speech in Hong Kong. Did Google agree with CCP's decision to lie to the world about the COVID-19 pandemic? Then I thought about Google's Dragonfly experiment. I wondered if perhaps you agreed with the Chinese government's use of technology platforms to spy on its own people and enforce draconian security laws. Maybe it's that your company is aligned with the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage policies, where the strategy is to steal whatever can't be produced domestically. These values that allow Google to work with the Chinese military but not the U.S. military help explain why Google wouldn't think twice about blatantly stealing a competitor's product, right down to the watermark, without any hint of attribution. Mr. Pichai, during our field hearing in my home state of Colorado, I heard a story that sounded so brazen and contrary to free market principles that I thought it must have been straight from the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage playbook. Google took advantage of a company that relied on your search engine to build its brand and compete. Google misappropriated lyrics from Genius Media Group's website and published those lyrics on Google's own platform. However, Genius caught Google in the act, quite literally red-handed. When Genius suspected this corporate theft was occurring, the company incorporated a digital watermark in its lyrics that spelled out red-handed. In Morse code, Google's lyric boxes contained the watermark, showing that your company stole what you couldn't or didn't want to produce yourself. After Google executives stated that they were investigating this problematic behavior, Genius created another experiment to determine the scope of the misappropriation. It turns out that out of 271 songs where the watermark was applied, 43% showed clear evidence of matching. Your company, which advertises itself as a doorway to freedom, took advantage of this small company, all but extinguishing Genius's freedom to compete. Google is supposed to connect people to information. Your corporate values once stood for freedom, a platform that let capitalism flourish and helped bring countless people across the globe out of poverty. My question to you, Mr. Pichai, do you think that Google could get away with following China's corporate espionage playbook if you didn't have a monopolistic advantage in the market?
Congressman, I want to be able to address the important concerns you raised. First of all, we are proud to support the U.S. government. We recently signed a big project with the Department of Defense where we are bringing our world-class, zero trust-based cybersecurity approach to help protect Pentagon networks from cybersecurity attacks. We have projects underway with the Navy, with Department of Veterans Affairs. Happy to follow up and explain more. We have a very limited presence in China. We don't offer any of our services, search, maps, Gmail, YouTube, etc. in China. And with respect to music, we license content there. In fact, we license content from other companies. And so this is a dispute between Genius and the other companies in terms of where the source of the content is. But again, happy to engage and explain what we do here further.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Mr. Zuckerberg, in his written testimony, made the claim that Facebook is an American company with American values. Do any of the rest of you take a different view? That is to say that your companies don't embrace American values. It's great to see that none of you do. Mr. Pichai, I'm worried about Google's market power, how it concentrates that power, and then ultimately how it wields it. Project Maven was a collaboration between Google and the Department of Defense that Google pulled out of, citing ethical concerns, and you made the decision to pull out of that joint venture following receipt of a letter from thousands of your employees saying that Google should not be in the business of war. My question, Mr. Pichai, is did you weigh the input from your employees when making the decision to abandon that project with the United States military?
Congressman, thanks for your concern. As I said earlier, we're deeply committed to supporting the military and the U.S. government. We have undertaken several projects since then. We do take our employees' input into account, but it's one input. We make decisions based on a variety of factors. As a company, we were new in the cloud space at that time. Since then,
thank you. That's a sufficient answer that you did take their feedback into account. And in fact, some of your Googlers have recently sent you a letter where they've asked you to exit other partnerships as a consequence of ethical concerns. They've asked you to stop doing business with American law enforcement, saying that police broadly uphold white supremacy and that Google should not be engaged in any services to police. And as you well know, you provide some of the most basic services to police like email, but you also provide services that help keep our cops safe when they're doing their job. And so my question is here in front of Congress and the American people, will you take the pledge that Google will not adopt the bigoted anti-police policy that is requested in the most recent letter?
Congressman, we have a long track record of working with law enforcement when it is supported by due process and the law. We push back against overbroad requests. We are transparent about the requests we get, but we have a long history of following the law and cooperating with law enforcement.
I understand the history. I'm asking about the future. To the law enforcement that are watching today, can they rest assured that under your leadership, Google will not adopt these bigoted anti-police policies?
Congressman, we are committed to continuing to work with law enforcement in a way that's consistent with law and due processes in the U.S.
Well, I greatly appreciate that, and I know that will be very comforting to the police who utilize your services. You mentioned earlier in the discussion about China that your engagement in China was very limited, but yet Google has an AI China Center. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has published a paper saying that enhanced the targeting capabilities of China's J-20 fighter aircraft. You collaborate with Chinese universities that take millions upon millions of dollars from the Chinese military. Matter of fact, one of your Googlers, Fifi Li, while under your employ, was cited in Chinese state media saying, "China is like a sleeping giant. When she wakes, she will tremble the world." The former Secretary of Defense, Mr. Shanahan, said that the lines have been blurred in China between commercial and military application. And as Mr. Buck cited, General Dunford says that your company is directly aiding the Chinese military. And Peter Thiel, who actually serves on Mr. Zuckerberg's board at Facebook, said that Google's activities with China are treasonous. He accused you of treason. So why would an American company with American values so directly aid the Chinese military, but have ethical concerns about working alongside the U.S. military on Project Maven? And I understand your point about cybersecurity and those things, but Project Maven was a specific way to ensure that our troops are safe on the battlefield. And if you have no problem making the J-20 Chinese fighter more effective in its targeting, why wouldn't you want to make America as effective?
Congressman, with respect, we are not working with the Chinese military. It's absolutely false. I had a chance to meet with General Dunford personally. We have clarified what we do in China compared to our peers. It's very, very limited in nature. Our AI work in China is limited to a handful of people working on open source projects, and happy to share and engage with the office to explain.
An American company is directly aiding China, when you have an AI center, when you're working with universities, and when your employees are talking about China trembling the world, it seems to really call into question your commitment to our country and our values. I see my time's expired. I hope we have an additional round, Mr. Chairman.
North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong for 5 minutes.
Google has received criticism about bias against conservatives and content moderation. There were threats of demonetizing the Federalist and numerous other complaints of viewpoint suppression. As a result, a significant portion of the American public has lost trust in your company. A lack of public confidence in a product usually means there is economic harm to the company. But that just isn't the case with Google. So I think it's a legitimate question as to whether Google's market power insulates it from loss of revenue normally associated with offending half the people who use your product. I also think it's a legitimate question to ask if other attempts to regulate your industries have worked. So, Mr. Pichai, Google has restricted advertising analytics or the portability of user data related to advertising due to compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation. Specifically, in 2018, Google restricted the ability to export the double ID, a cookie-based identifier that compiles individual user data and creates profiles through Google data transfer. Is that correct?
Congressman, not familiar with the specifics of that particular issue, but happy to follow up more once I understand it better.
So you're not particularly familiar with how you're complying with GDPR?
Congressman, we've long been working to comply with GDPR. We think it's an important regulation, and we are in full compliance to the extent of my knowledge. I just meant I'm not aware of that specific issue with the identifier you mentioned there, but happy to understand it better and follow up.
All right, so in order to comply with GDPR, Google must retain control over more user data and restrict the ability to combine this user data with other platforms to conduct cross-platform analysis. It seems as if that ultimately limits the ability of advertisers to make comparisons between Google-based campaigns and non-Google-based campaigns. Would you agree with that?
In all these ecosystems, we are balancing between users, advertisers, and publishers. We deeply care about the privacy and security of our users. And so when we serve these ecosystems, we have to take that into account. We have to comply with important laws and regulations in every country we operate in. And so that's the delicate balance we are constantly striking. But we are focused on our users and trying to do the best we can.
And I just want to be perfectly clear. I personally believe that just the market power consolidation is significant, but I also want to be clear that when we're moving forward to regulate this, that we aren't actually squeezing out competition in our quest to do something. Because I've said that before in this hearing, and I'll say it again. Usually in our quest to regulate big companies, we end up hurting small companies more. And I'm a strong privacy advocate, but the consequences of GDPR have been to further entrench large established actors like Google, leading to regulatory capture that exasperates competition concerns. And Google's digital ad market share has increased since the implementation of GDPR. Do you know that to be correct?
Congressman, to just give you a sense of the robust competition we see, ad prices have fallen down by 40% in the past 10 years. And in fact, in the US, advertising as a share of GDP has come down from 1.4% in 1992, less than 1% today. So we see robust competition in the marketplace. And as I said earlier, we have to comply with regulation. We have to interpret it strictly, and we have to balance the ecosystem. But our utmost care is ensuring privacy and security of our users as we serve these markets.
And I'm glad you mentioned privacy, because I would be remiss if I didn't deal with this issue, because it is so relevant. And I think generally speaking, outside of the political issues and the biases with all of this, and this is for essentially all four of our witnesses, I think one of our bigger concerns when we talk about data and value, and that data having value and privacy, which is where people really get concerned with how the digital age is moving forward. And there are news reports that law enforcement has made increasing use of what are called geofence warrants. And these geofence warrants allow authorities to compel technology companies to disclose location records for any device in a certain area at a particular time. Court filings suggest that Google received a 1,500% increase in geofence requests from 2017 to 2018, and a 500% increase from 2018 till 2019. And so the Fourth Amendment requires probable cause and specificity, and that's not what these are. These warrants are essentially for any person in an area at a particular time, and geofence warrants require neither. So unless accompanied by particularized information and identifying a subject, geo warrants are essentially general warrants. I believe that the location information should be considered as contents of the Electronic Communications Act under the Stored Communications Act. Do you agree?
Happy to understand more. We deeply care about, this is why we issue transparency reports, because we think it's an important area for Congress to have oversight. And we recently made a change by which we automatically delete location activity after a certain period of time by default for our users. So we are happy to engage with your office, Congressman, and
I'm using you because these are going on in Virginia and New York, I think, right now. But I mean, this equates for everything. I think people would be terrified to know that law enforcement could grab general warrants and get everybody's information anywhere. So it requires Congress to act, and it requires everybody that is a witness in this hearing to be willing to work too, because it is the single most important issue I think we're going to.
Time of the gentleman has expired, but I believe he has. A unanimous consent request.
I do. I have a unanimous consent request for a Wall Street Journal article, police request for Google users' location histories face new scrutiny.
Without objection.
And then I have two letters. The letters are from Congressman Walden, Congresswoman McMorris Rogers. The first letter is to Mr. Cook of Apple. The second letter is to Mr. Pichai.
Without objection, both may be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being.
Mr. Pichai, I'd like to start with you, and I'm just going to illustrate my question with a factual incident that actually occurred to me. Several months ago, my wife called and said, hey, there's a good article on the Gateway Pundit that you should read. So out of curiosity, I was up here in Washington, out of curiosity, I Googled Gateway Pundit. And it didn't show up on the first page, didn't show up on the second page. There was a bunch of different blogging sites about how there were disagreements with what was on the Gateway Pundit. But I actually had to type in gatewaypundit.com to get to it. Interestingly, Google didn't allow me to get to the actual website. That was a couple of months ago, before this hearing was set to be heard, before this hearing was noticed, before you knew that you would be appearing before us today, and that this is an issue that obviously conservatives and Republicans have had. Last week, after this was noticed, this hearing was noticed, I did the exact same thing here in the Capitol. And wouldn't you know it, I Googled Gateway Pundit, and that was the very first website that came up. Now, this isn't from a constituent in my district. This isn't from somebody telling me. This isn't a news report. I actually physically did this on my laptop here in the Capitol several months ago and then today. So clearly, something had happened between not being notified that you were going to be appearing before our committee and then last week knowing that you would be appearing before our committee, and suddenly conservative websites are now at the top of the bar when you search for them. So was there anything done at Google between a couple of months ago and last week or the week before you appearing today that has changed your approach to silencing conservative websites?
Congressman, we approach our work with a deep sense of responsibility, in a nonpartisan way. We want to serve all our users, no matter where they are. In fact, it's in our long-term business incentive to do so. And I believe on our platforms, including YouTube, there are more conservative voices than ever before, and we believe in freedom of expression. On the specific issue, I will have to look into it. I obviously wasn't aware of it. We do, it could be a number of reasons. We constantly get reports.
So if you're going to look into it for me, can I expect a response from you, say, in the next 2 weeks as to why that occurred?
Congressman, we'll do our best to follow up, and I'll engage with your office to
okay, we'll follow up on that. I've got a similar question. So I've been in elected politics for almost 10 years. And when I was in the Florida Senate and the state Senate, I never had a problem with my campaign emails being marked as spam or going to junk folders or anything along those lines. And we had 30, 40, 50,000 people on our email list. And suddenly I get elected to Congress, and I'm now up here in Washington, D.C., and my parents who have a Gmail account aren't getting my campaign emails. My supporters, just last week, one of my supporters called me and said, hey, I just want you to know this, that my Gmail account suddenly is taking your campaign emails that I've received for almost 10 years, and suddenly they're going to spam and junk folders. This appears to only be happening
to conservative Republicans. I don't see anything in the news or anything in the press or other members on the other side of the aisle talking about their campaign emails getting thrown into junk folders in Gmail. So my question is why is this only happening to Republicans? And it's a fact, it's happening because I can have my supporters testify that they've received my emails for 9 years, and suddenly this last year, all of their Gmail, my campaign emails in their Gmail are going to their spam folder. So if you could give me some clarification on that, I would appreciate it.
In Gmail, we are focused on what users want, and users have indicated they want us to organize their personal emails they receive from friends and family separately. And so all we have done is we have a tabbed organization, and the primary tab has emails from friends and family, and the secondary tab has other notifications and so on. These things
it was my father who was not receiving now my campaign emails. So clearly that familial thing that you're talking about didn't apply to my emails.
Our systems probably are not able to understand that that it's your father. Obviously, we don't have that context there. We just apply it neutrally across all organizations
well, what assurances can you give me that there's my time's short. One last question. What assurances can you give me that any bias amongst your employees isn't influencing your spam folder algorithms?
Congressman, there's nothing in the algorithm which has anything to do with political ideology, and we do get complaints across the aisle. For example, the World Socialist Review complained in January of this year that their site wasn't found in Google search results, and so we get complaints. We look into it, but we approach our work in a nonpartisan way, and it's in our long-term incentive to serve users across the country. And today, that's why we invest in our radars in 49 states across the U.S. so that we can capture all viewpoints.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I know. Mr. Jordan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, is Google going to tailor its features to help Joe Biden in the 2020 election?
Congressman, we approach our work, we support both campaigns today. We think political ads is an important part of free speech and democratic society.
Remember, he's the CEO of Google, but also YouTube.
And we engage with campaigns, according to law, and we approach our work in a nonpartisan way.
It was a yes or no question. Can you assure Americans today you won't tailor your features to help Joe Biden in the upcoming election?
We support work that campaigns do. I just want to make sure I
understand that. We all do all kinds of online, social media, all kinds of that outreach, that communication. This is a simple question. Can you today assure Americans you will not tailor your features in any way to specifically help one candidate over other? And this what I'm concerned about is you helping Joe Biden over President Trump.
We won't do any work, to politically tilt anything one way or the other. It's against our core values.
But you did it in 2016. There's an email in 2016 that was widely circulated amongst the executives at your company that got public, where Ms. Ileana Murillo, head of your multicultural marketing, talks about the silent donation Google made to the Clinton campaign, and you applauded her work. She points that out in the email. I'm just curious, if you did it in 16, I want to make, in spite of the fact you did it in 16, President Trump won, I just want to make sure you're not going to do it again in 2020.
Congressman, I recall our conversation at that time, and I appreciate your concern. We didn't find any evidence of such activity, and I took the opportunity after our conversation to reinforce to the company. We realized even an appearance could be improper, so we have clearly communicated to our employees any personal political activity, while that's their right, needs to happen on their own time and resources and should avoid any use of company.
Of course, everyone's got their First Amendment rights to campaign for who they want. What they can't do is configure your features to help one candidate over the other. So you might have not have found any evidence, but here's what she wrote to the email to a number of key executives in your company. Quote, we push to get out the Latino vote with our features. Second quote, we push to get out the Latino vote with our features in key states. Seems to me those last three words are the real qualifier here. That's electioneering when you're trying to increase the Latino vote in key states. And she'd already communicated that she was supporting Clinton, that she wanted Clinton to win. So when she talks about increasing the Latino vote, which she assumed was going to help candidate Clinton, and she's doing that in key states. It's one thing if you're going to increase the Latino vote around the country. If you're just a good corporate citizen, you're urging people to vote. It's quite another when you're focusing on in key states. And you know what those key states were? Nevada and Florida, the swing states. So again, I want to make sure this isn't going to happen in 2020.
I can assure you that we complied with laws in 2016. As a company, any work we do around elections is nonpartisan. Users do come to us for understanding where polling places are, where to vote, which is the date to vote, what the voting hours are. We are committed to providing that information, and I can assure you that we will approach our work.
So Mr. Pichai, here's the question I think is on so many Americans' minds. They saw the list that we read here earlier on in our opening statements, all the things Google has done. Google is siding with the World Health Organization over anyone who disagrees with them, even though the World Health Organization obviously lied to America, obviously shills for China. Google's siding with them. YouTube is siding with them. We have the history of all the things Google has done and the history of what happened in 2016 in the election where they obviously, according to one of your multicultural marketing executive, tried to help Clinton. And here we are 97 days before the election, and we want to make sure it's not going to happen again. We want to can you give us two assurances? One, you're not going to try to tailor your features, configure your platform in a way to help Joe Biden. And second, that you're not going to use your search engine to silence conservatives. Can you give us those two assurances today?
I want you to hear this, YouTube. I want you to hear this.
Congressman, on our search engine, conservatives have more access to information than ever before.
And we appreciate that. That wasn't the question. Can you assure us today you're not going to try to silence conservatives? And can you assure us today you're not going to try to configure your features as Ms. Murillo said you did for Clinton in 2016? Can you assure us today you're not going to do the same thing for Joe Biden in 2020?
You have my commitment. It's always been true, and we'll continue to conduct ourselves in a neutral way.
Appreciate it. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scan.
I almost feel like I need to rewind that part. Let's just rewind that one little part right there. Oh, I messed up. Let me find it. Hang on. Give me 2 seconds.
Can you assure us today you're not going to try to silence conservatives? And can you assure us today you're not going to try to configure your features as Ms. Murillo said you did for Clinton in 2016? Can you assure us today you're not going to do the same thing for Joe Biden in 2020?
You have my commitment. It's always been true, and we'll continue to conduct ourselves in a neutral way.
Appreciate it. Yield back.
Bezos, thank you for being here today. I'm concerned that you've used Amazon's dominant market position to unfairly harm competition. We've heard from a number of companies that Amazon uses proprietary data from third-party companies to launch its own private label products, meets with startups to discuss investing in the product, and then uses the proprietary data from these meetings to create its own private label products, allows the sale of counterfeit items through its web platform. During this subcommittee's field hearing in Boulder this January, PopSocket's CEO and inventor David Barnett detailed how Amazon allowed counterfeit products to appear on Amazon's marketplace ahead of PopSocket's products. Mr. Barnett told CNBC that PopSockets found at least 1,000 counterfeit products for sale on Amazon's marketplace, which Amazon allegedly failed to remedy until PopSockets agreed to a nearly $2 million marketing deal with Amazon. We've also seen troubling reports in the Wall Street Journal detailing Amazon's use of third-party sellers' proprietary data to develop and market its own competitive private label products. The Wall Street Journal also reported last week that Amazon's venture capital fund used meetings with unsuspecting startup companies to gain access to secret proprietary product information and financial details. Amazon then reportedly used that information to launch competing products, often disastrous results for the original startup company. There are many examples of this behavior, but one allegation in the journal's reporting sticks out in particular. In 2011, Amazon contacted Vocalife, LLC's inventor, about the possibility of investing in the speech detection technology. Vocalife's founder accepted the meeting thinking this was the company's big break. After displaying Vocalive's microphone technology and providing proprietary information, including engineering data, to Amazon employees, the relationship came to an abrupt halt. Amazon employees allegedly stopped responding to emails before the technology eventually found its way into the Amazon's Echo device. These allegations are serious, especially because the size and scope of these practices couldn't happen without Amazon's monopolistic control of the marketplace. I'm also concerned that given Amazon's allowance of counterfeit goods on its marketplace, especially counterfeit goods from China, that Amazon's marketplace may be knowingly or unknowingly furthering China's use of forced and slave labor conditions. This is especially important following recent reports that at least 80 global companies that sell on the Amazon marketplace, including Nike, Starbucks, and Samsung, have ties to Chinese factories that use enslaved Uyghur Muslims. Following these concerning reports, Senator Hawley introduced an important bill last week requiring American businesses to certify that their supply chain does not rely on forced labor. I will be introducing the House companion bill later this afternoon. While I do not expect you to have intimate knowledge of the legislation, I do want to ask all four of our witnesses a simple yes or no question. Will you certify here today that your company does not use and will never use slave labor to manufacture your products or allow products to be sold on your platform that are manufactured using slave labor? Mr. Cook, you were kind enough to visit with me on the phone. I think we briefly discussed this issue. If you can give a yes or no answer, and I understand you haven't read the details of the bill, but would you agree to this idea?
I would love to engage on the legislation with you, Congressman, but let me be clear, forced labor is abhorrent. And we would not tolerate it in Apple. And so I would love to get with your office and engage on the legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Pichai.
Congressman, I share your concern in this area. I find it abhorrent as well. Happy to engage with your office and discuss this further.
So I really don't want to even engage with my office half the time. Will you guys agree that slave labor is not something that you will tolerate in manufacturing your products or in products that are sold on your platforms?
I agree, Congressman.
And Mr. Cook?
We wouldn't tolerate it. We would terminate a supplier relationship if it were found.
Mr. Zuckerberg?
I agree. We wouldn't tolerate this, and if we found anything like this, we would also terminate any relationship.
And Mr. Bezos?
Yes, I agree completely.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and I yield back.
I want you to make sure that you heard they testified from the Senate that if they found out or knew that they were using any kind of slave labor, that they would not utilize, sell, or promote basically their products on their sites. Yes, you heard this.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to
5 minutes.
Mr. Pichai, during our prior discussion earlier today, you said that Google doesn't work with the Chinese military. That answer was deceptive because Google works with many of the entities that work with the Chinese military in common collaboration. And just as one example would be Tsinghua University, where Jeff Dean, who is the head of Google AI, served on the Computer Science Advisory Committee for the university, and then the university takes nearly $15 million from China's Central Military Commission. So you can see how even if you don't literally show up at the offices of the Chinese military, if you're all showing up at the same place, working together on AI, that would lead to my concern. But I want to talk about search because that's an area where I know Google has real market dominance. On December 11th, you testified to the Judiciary Committee, and in response to a question from my colleague Zoe Lofgren about search, you said, "We don't manually intervene on any particular search result." But leaked memos obtained by the Daily Caller show that that isn't true. In fact, those memos were altered December 3rd, just a week before your testimony, and they describe a deceptive news blacklist and a process for developing that blacklist approved by Ben Gomes, who leads search with your company, and also something called a fringe ranking, which seems to beg the question, who gets to decide what's fringe? And in your answer, you said to Ms. Lofgren that there is no manual intervention of search. That was your testimony, and now I'm going to cite specifically from this memo from the Daily Caller. It says that the Daily Caller obtained from your company. It says the beginning of the workflow starts when a website is placed on a watch list. It continues, this watch list is maintained and stored by ARIS with access restricted to policy and enforcement specialists. Sort of does beg the question who these enforcement specialists are. Access to the listing can also be shared on a need-to-know basis to enforce or enrich the policy violations. The investigation of the watch list is done in the tool Athena, the ARIS manual review tool. So you said to Congresswoman Lofgren that there was no manual review tool, and then your documents indicate that there is a manual review tool. So help us understand the inconsistency.
Congressman, there are two parts to this. In general, we algorithmically approach our search results. We have robust policies to do so, and we test it both with user feedback and we use raters to validate. Last year alone, we ran over 300,000 experiments and launched around 3,000 improvements to search. And we don't manually tune. The question last time was in the context of, is there someone behind the curtain manually tuning an individual search result? We don't. We generally approach it algorithmically. We, however, in order to comply with the law in every country we operate in, for example, there may be an actor or a website identified as interference.
So he's basically saying, trying to spin this as, well, it's not our fault because our algorithm does it. Who sets the algorithm? Google.
In elections, and we then have to put that site on a list so that doesn't appear in our search results against queries. So other examples would be violent extremism.
And is that done manually, Mr. Pichai? That process you described, is that done manually?
And we could get reports from law enforcement agencies. We are complying with, or it's a known DMCA-based.
There is either a manual component or there is not a manual component. Which is it?
For creating those lists, that process can involve manual portions.
Okay, great. Well, that is sort of the concern that I have. You've now said something different today than you said to Ms. Lofgren, because you've confessed that there is a manual component to the way in which you blacklist content. And it seems to be no coincidence that it's sites like Gateway Pundit, The Western Journal, American Spectator, Daily Caller, and Breitbart that receive the ire or the negative treatment as a consequence of your manual tooling. And it also seems noteworthy that whistleblowers at your own company have spoken out. You said that one of the reasons you maintain this manual tool is to stop election interference. I believe it is in fact your company that is engaging in election interference. And it's not just my view. Mike Wacker came out and was a whistleblower indicating that the manual blacklist targets that Google specifically goes after are those who support President Trump, who hold a conservative viewpoint, and he left your company in 2019 because he was speaking out against these outraged mobs. So can you see how when you empower individuals, some of the same individuals that Project Veritas has exposed as labeling people as terrorists who say make America great again or who support the president, that in fact can be the very election interference that we're concerned about, and that you're using your market dominance in search to accomplish that election interference?
Congressman, with respect, I strongly disagree with that characterization. We don't approach this work with any political viewpoint. We do that to comply with law, known copyright violations, very in narrow circumstances, and we have to do that to comply with the law. And in many cases, those requests can come from law enforcement agencies.
Your own employees are saying you're doing it for a different reason. Your own employees are saying it's political bias. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr.
And I'm sorry, may I be recognized for unanimous consent request?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, just given the productivity of our discussion, I'd request that we be permitted a third round of questioning.
Without objection. Yielding, I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to pick up where I left off. Mr. Pichai, there are rioting groups that are going unchecked with the posting of what I would contend is very violent video, yet yesterday I was sent a YouTube video about doctors discussing hydrochloroquine and discussing the not dangers of children returning to school. And when I clicked on the link, it was taken down. And then I was sent a different link on YouTube and it was taken down. I just checked again just to make sure. And it says that this video has been removed for violating YouTube's community guidelines. How can doctors giving their opinion on a drug that they think is effective for the treatment of COVID-19 and doctors who think it's appropriate for children to return back to school violate YouTube's community guidelines when all of these videos of violence is all posted on YouTube?
Congressman, we believe in freedom of expression, and there is a lot of debate on YouTube about effective ways to deal with COVID. We allow robust debate. But in the area during a pandemic, we look to local health authorities. So for example, in the US, it would be CDC for guidelines around medical misinformation in a narrow way, which could cause harm in the real world. And so for example, if there is aspects of a video, and if it explicitly states something could be a proven cure, and that doesn't meet CDC guidelines,
it's free expression of speech, and you have these doctors who are giving their opinion as doctors, and I don't understand why YouTube and therefore Google thinks it's appropriate to silence physicians and their opinion of what can help and cure people with COVID-19. I'm going to switch quickly to Mr. Zuckerberg. I think at this point it's fairly obvious that technology platforms have been stifling conservative news and opinions. You employ a panel of content moderators. Can you explain how Facebook chooses who these moderators are?
Thanks, Congressman. We do hire a lot of people around the world to work on safety and security. Our team is more than 30 or 35,000 people working on that now. We certainly try to do this in a way that is neutral to all viewpoints. We want to be a platform for all ideas. I don't think you build a social product with the goal of giving people a voice if you don't believe that people being able to express a wide variety of things is ultimately valuable for the world. And we try to make sure that our policies and our operations ultimately reflect and carry that out.
Is there an ideological diversity amongst the content moderators?
Congressman, I don't think we choose to hire them on the basis of an ideology. They're hired all over the world. There's certainly a bunch in the U.S. There's diversity in where they're hired, but certainly we don't want to have any bias in what we do, and we wouldn't tolerate it if we discovered that.
So you don't specifically hire, say, conservative moderators and Democrat or liberal moderators so that there's a balance in your content moderators?
Congressman, in terms of the 30 to 35,000 people or more at this point who are doing safety and security review, that is correct. In terms of the people setting the policies, I think it is valuable to have people with a diversity of viewpoints involved so we can make sure that we have the different viewpoints represented in the policy development process. And we also consult with a number of outside groups whenever we develop new policies to make sure that we're taking into account all perspectives.
What are some of those outside groups that would be conservative leaning?
Congressman, I need to get back to you with a list of specific groups, but it would depend on what the topic is.
Can you just think of one? I mean, you said you reach out to outside groups. Can you think of one conservative outside group that you reach out to and use as a content moderator?
Congressman, I'm talking about different external stakeholders and groups that are inputs to our policy development process. And I'm not involved in those conversations directly, so I would have to get back to you with specifics on that. But I'm quite confident that we speak with people across the ideological spectrum when we're developing our policies.
I would very much appreciate a follow-up on that. Real quickly, can you briefly explain the approval process for third-party fact checkers, and how many fact checkers does Facebook employ?
Yes, thanks. We work with about 70 fact-checking partners around the world, and the goal of the program is to limit the distribution of viral hoaxes, so things that are clearly false, from getting a lot of distribution, but we don't ourselves want to be in the business of determining what is true and what is false. That feels like an inappropriate role for us to play.
I want you to remember that every single one of these platforms ran Russiagate for 3 freaking years. The Steele dossier and everything that came out about the Russia hoax was plastered all over these forums.
We rely on an organization called the Pointer Institute, and I think it's called the Independent Fact-Checking Organization that has a set of guidelines of what makes an independent fact-checker, and they certify those fact-checkers, and then any organization that gets certification from that group is qualified to be a fact-checking partner within Facebook.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. We're going to I'm going to recognize Mr. Johnson for Mr. Jordan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Zuckerberg, just as Mr. Pichai gave prior testimony to Congress saying there wasn't editorial manipulation on their platform, you have previously given testimony to the Congress saying that there is not editorial manipulation that disadvantages conservatives. And just like in the case of Google, there have been whistleblowers from Facebook that not only have offered evidence indicating your testimony was not truthful, but there's even video that suggests that content moderators that you employ are out there disadvantaging conservative content. I'm wondering if you are familiar with the experiences of Zach McElroy and Ryan Hartwig, 2 people who participated in Facebook content review, and what is your response to the very damning video evidence and the testimony from them that the culture that you lead within Facebook is one that disadvantages conservatives and leads to content manipulation?
So, Congressman, I'm somewhat familiar with the concerns that they've raised, and as I've said, we aim to be a platform for all ideas. We got into this because we want to give everyone a voice. I certainly do not want our platforms to be run in a way that has any ideological bias, and I want people to be able to discuss a range of issues. When people raise concerns like that, we do look into them to make sure that that everyone in our operation is behaving and upholding the standards that we would like. And if the behavior that they cited is true, then that would be unacceptable in our operation.
And following the release of those videos and that evidence from Project Veritas, will you then describe the investigation that Facebook undertook to root out these very corrosive effects on your platform?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to you with more details on that, but I know that we have ongoing training in what we do, and we certainly will look into any complaints that come up, and we want to make sure that in how we run the content review teams, that it's done in a way that reflects the values of the company around giving everyone a voice and being a platform for all ideas.
I'm concerned that the content review does reflect the values of the company, but those values don't in fact give everyone a voice. They prejudice against certain content. And while I appreciate training as a prophylactic endeavor to try to guide future content, it seems disingenuous for you to suggest that these videos come out that are very damning, that show the people that you trust with content moderation admitting on video that they disadvantage conservatives, that they label people who support the president as a way to push down their content and limit the reach of that content, for you to then come to us many months later after that was all over the news and the internet and say, well, you know, you'll get back to us and you do a little training. It seems to suggest that you don't take these allegations and this evidence very seriously. And so I'll ask the question perhaps in a different way. Would you revise your prior, in your prior testimony to Energy and Commerce, you said this does not happen, it cannot happen. Would you at least be willing to acknowledge, based on the irrefutable evidence before us that you don't seem to have investigated, that it is possible that at Facebook, your employees do have the power to disadvantage conservative viewpoints, and that they in fact have used that power in ways that we need to root out?
Congressman, my testimony in the past and today is about what our principles are as a company and what we try to do. Of course, when you have tens of thousands of employees, people make mistakes. People have some of their own goals some of the time, and it's our job in running the company to make sure that we minimize errors and that we make sure that the company's operations reflect the principles that we intend to run it on.
And when you fire people as a consequence of their politics, do you think that that impacts the culture and perhaps empowers some of the content moderators to also treat people worse as a consequence of their politics?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'm not aware of any case where we have fired someone on behalf of their politics, and I would say that that would be an inappropriate thing for us to do.
Why did you fire Palmer Luckey?
Congressman, I'm not sure it's appropriate to get into a specific personnel issue publicly.
I mean, I could just tell you that Palmer Luckey's NDA
not...
with you, I only have 10 seconds, but Palmer Luckey's NDA with you doesn't allow him to talk to anyone except government officials. I'm a government official. I've seen the messages where you have specifically directed Mr. Luckey to make statements regarding his politics for the benefit of your company. So I think both in the case of these content moderators and in the case of the testimony you just gave regarding Mr. Luckey and firing people over their politics, there is serious question as to whether or not you're giving truthful testimony here or whether it's lying before Congress. I see my time's expired and I'll yield back.
Yeah, watch that face right there.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm just going to play this lady's portion just so you hear the facts. She talks about Google's purchase of YouTube.
Lady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pache, I wanted to focus a little bit on Google's acquisition of YouTube and some of the consequences of that move for consumer privacy and competition. Now, Google purchased YouTube in 2006 after identifying it as a potential rival that could eventually draw business away from Google. And it's my understanding Google paid $1.65 billion for that acquisition, nearly 30 times its original bid of $50 million. So could you tell us why Google was willing to pay so much more beyond the initial proposed bid? And was this as a result of any analysis on the harm Google would suffer if a competitor had purchased YouTube?
Congresswoman, we acquired YouTube in 2006, and this was well before my time there as CEO, and I wasn't directly involved. But what I do recall at the time is that we saw it as a new emerging area, and our mission is to help users with information. We saw an opportunity, and it wasn't clear. YouTube only had 67 people.
Okay, was Mr. Page in charge of that decision?
Congresswoman, I wasn't directly involved, but I am pretty sure our senior leadership team at that time definitely looked into it.
Okay, I would encourage the subcommittee to take the steps necessary to have us hear from whoever was in charge of that. Moving on, Google is now by far the top online site where Americans watch videos, including children's videos. And as I'm sure you're aware, federal law prevents companies from collecting data on children under 13. However, just last year, the Federal Trade Commission found that Google had spent years knowingly collecting data on children under 13 on YouTube and offering advertisers the ability to target those children directly. Mr. Pache, did YouTube use the data it illegally acquired to improve its ability to target ads to children?
We are, this is an area, I take it very seriously. I'm a parent too. We are committed. We have invested tremendously. We have a dedicated product.
And this is a non-answer if you haven't figured it out yet. He's word salad.
For kids in YouTube Kids on the main YouTube platform. We make sure we have clear policies. We enforce them rigorously. Just in Q4 of 2019, we flagged and removed almost close to 1 million videos potentially for concerns around child safety. So it's an area we are investing rigorously and will continue to do so.
Well, I'm more concerned about the fact that you're investing rigorously in luring in advertisers like toy makers, Mattel, and Hasbro by telling them that YouTube is the #1 website regularly visited by kids. So that sounds like you're targeting the kids and then targeting advertisers to bring them on board. Is that correct?
Today, the main site of YouTube. We don't allow anyone under 13 to create accounts. There are scenarios in which there could be family viewing, and today there are creators who create content oriented towards families, and as part of that, there are advertisers which are interested in connecting with those users. But everything we do here, we obviously comply with all the applicable regulations. And
Okay, well, let's look at some of the content that is specifically for children. COPA makes it illegal to target those kids, but we've got an issue where content creators are in a very difficult position now. So if a show like Sesame Street doesn't want to show ads for junk food on YouTube, does YouTube allow it to make that choice?
Today, we do, we have choices both for creators in terms of, tools and preferences, and we have extensive tools for advertisers, and above all for users, we give a choice. They can either use YouTube as a subscription service without seeing those types of ads, or they can use it for free with ads. So we give choice, and for us, it is of utmost importance.
No, their choice is you can pay for this and you don't see any ads, or it's free and you see the ads. So his answer to her was no. The answer to her was no. And she said, is there a way for them to opt out of certain ads? Oh yeah, you can pay for it.
That YouTube is a place where people come to learn, and we find increasingly small and medium businesses use YouTube to thrive, especially even during COVID, particularly.
Oh, let's go back
to content that's designed for children. So, if there's an organization like Sesame Street that wants to provide child-centered content, but they don't want that content to be sullied, shall we say, with junk food ads or something, my understanding is that you say that the content creators can do that, but we've got a recent report from the Wall Street Journal that says YouTube hasn't been honoring those requests, and it's been making it difficult for independent auditing companies like OpenSlate to independently audit that and then report back to those content creators about whether or not YouTube is honoring those. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the particular report, but I'm happy to understand it better and have my office follow up with your staff, Congressman.
I would appreciate that. My time has expired. I yield.
Mr. Bezos, we were cut short in our last discussion. I just wanted to give you the chance to clear this up. You don't believe Dr. Ben Carson is an extremist, do you?
No, sir, I don't.
So help me understand why you would partner with a group that labels him as someone worthy of an extremist watch list.
Well, I want you to hopefully appreciate when we're trying to make it possible for people to donate to any number from millions of different charities. And we need to have some source of data to use. And while I accept what you're saying, that the Southern Poverty Law Center and the U.S. Foreign Asset Office are not perfect, and I would like a better source if we could get it, that is what we use today.
Well, that's breaking news. It's great to hear that you do recognize the infirmities in the Southern Poverty Law Center, and there are, I guess, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Pichai's companies use them as well. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe that Dr. Ben Carson is an extremist?
No, Congressman.
And so why would you trust the people who think he is?
Congressman, I'm not aware of where we work with the organization that you're saying.
Oh, the
gentleman's time has expired. And I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Cook, is the cancel culture mob dangerous?
It's something I'm not all the way up to speed on, but if you're talking about where somebody with a different point of view talks and they're canceled, I don't think that's good. I think it's good for people to hear different points of view and decide for themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to just reference a letter. Barry Weiss, who resigned as an editor at the New York Times, she wrote a letter explaining why she resigned. And I'll just read 3 sentences for all of you, actually. She says, first of all, my own forays into wrongthink made me the subject of constant bullying by my colleagues who disagree with my views. She then says later in the letter, everyone lives in fear of the digital thunderdome. The online venom is excused so long as it is directed at the proper targets. And those targets aren't just conservative. In fact, Ms. Weiss is actually center left. She's not conservative. The targets are anyone who disagrees with the mob. Are the rest of you concerned about the cancel culture mob and what it's up to? Mr. Pichai?
Congressman, I'm sorry, I had momentary difficulty hearing. But, you know, we've built platforms which allow for freedom of expression, and we take pride in the fact that across our platforms, including YouTube, there are more diverse voices than ever before. It is something we are committed to.
I'm just saying, I'm concerned about it. And again, I'm concerned about it not just because conservatives get attacked. I'm concerned when anyone gets attacked for expressing a viewpoint. I thought we had a First Amendment, and yet they constantly get attacked. How about you, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Yes, Congressman. I believe strongly in free expression. Giving people a voice is an important part of what our services do. And I'm very worried about some of the forces of illiberalism that I see in this country that are pushing against free expression. I think that this is one of the fundamental democratic traditions that we have in our country, and it's how we make progress over the long term on a number of issues. And our company is committed to doing what we can to protect people's voice.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Mr. Bezos?
Yes, sir. I am concerned in general about that. And what I find a little discouraging is that it appears to me that social media is a nuanced destruction machine. And I don't think that's helpful for a democracy.
You agree with the term she used, Ms. Weiss used, digital Thunderdome?
I see that, yes.
Yeah, I see it too. And I guess my point is you were four pretty important guys leading four of the most important companies on the planet, and it would sure be helpful if you spoke out against this. I mean, Mr. Cook, there was a 1984 Super Bowl ad in black and white, had this Big Brother type figure as the narrator saying over the screen to a bunch of these workers, looks like it was straight out of the Soviet Union, saying to a bunch of these workers as they're sort of marching along, he says one of the lines that the narrator uses is, "Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on the earth." And then the ad ends with this lady running in color and smashing the screen, busting the groupthink, busting the mob think. Do you remember that ad, Mr. Cook? What company had that ad?
I remember it very well. It was Apple versus IBM at the time.
Yeah, but the point was, mob think, cancel culture, groupthink is not what this country is about. And we are seeing it play out every single, just take the sports world, for goodness sake. In the last few weeks, Drew Brees had to bow to the mob simply because he suggested you should stand for the anthem. There was a football coach at Oklahoma State who wore the, quote, wrong T-shirt fishing with his boys. He got in all kinds of trouble. James Harden wears a mask saying, back the police, help the police, support the police. He gets attacked. Why don't we just let the First Amendment work? That's all we're asking. And you are four individuals who have so much influence. It would sure help if you're out there criticizing what the cancel culture mob is doing to this country. And people see it every single day. And I hope you'll do it. I hope you all said you disagree with it. I hope you'll really speak out against it and be fair with all viewpoints. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize the.
And I'm going to play this. She actually gets into how much Google makes during their ads on videos. Because, you know, again, they own YouTube.
For you, if you look at the screen, you will see that 50 to 60%, Google has 50 to 60% according to the Online Platforms and Digital Advertising CMA market study that was just released. And in order to buy and sell on these exchanges, websites and advertisers go through a middleman like Google's DV360 and Google Ads. If you look at the slide, Mr. Pichai, you can see that the share of this buy-side market that Google has is 50 to 90%, according to the same study. And I just want to simplify how these exchanges work. So, say in Seattle, Dee's Electronics, a mom-and-pop business, wants to buy online ad space in the Seattle Times. Dee's Electronics would need to go to a middleman, like Google Ads, which would then bid for ad space on an ad exchange. The problem is that Google controls all of these entities. So it's running the marketplace, it's acting on the buy side, and it's acting on the sell side at the same time, which is a major conflict of interest. It allows you to set rates very low as a buyer of ad space from newspapers, depriving them of their ad revenue, and then also to sell high to small businesses who are very dependent on advertising on your platform. It sounds a bit like a stock market, except unlike a stock market, there's no regulation on your ad exchange market. If there were regulation, it would actually prohibit insider trading, which means that the broker can't use the data in the broker division to buy and sell for their own interests. Instead, brokers have to serve the clients, their clients. Does Google have a similar obligation to serve its clients, the businesses that are selling and buying ad space?
Congresswoman, if I could explain this for a minute. We paid over $14 billion to publishers. We are deeply committed to journalism in this area. On an average, we pay out 69% of the revenue when publishers use Google's buy and sell side tools. And, you know, it's a low margin business for us. We do it because we want to help support publishers in this area.
I understand that, Mr. Pichai. What I'm trying to get at is when any company controls the buy and the sell side, I worked on Wall Street a very long time ago, there are reasons that insider trading is regulated, and this ad exchange is essentially the same thing. And without accountability, it isn't meaningful to just care about the newspapers. We're seeing them die all over, and ad revenue is a big reason. Let me put up a graph here that shows that Google's ad revenue is increasingly coming from ads on Google-owned sites and less so from other websites. Can you explain that trend?
I can't quite see whether this is net revenue or gross revenue. Obviously, when it comes to non-Google properties, we share the majority of revenue back to publishers.
Okay, and I'm going to stop it there because I'm exhausted. It is almost 3 in the morning. I've been doing this for several hours trying to go through these videos. I have a purpose in doing this. These are the things that they have testified in front of the Senate. As you know, they're full of shit. I hope that I focused mostly on Google because Google owns YouTube. I did not forget about old Zuckerberg. He's in there as well, a little bit of Bezos, but mostly YouTube because of what they testified to. And I think it's important to show them what they are saying they're doing versus what we're watching them do right now. And I'm sorry this was so long. I understand if you can't make it through all of it, but there's a reason I'm doing this. And with that, guys, have a great night. And thank you for hanging out, supporting us. We need it. There's not many of us left. And I feel like if we do still have a platform, we should use it for this very reason. Okay, thanks, guys. Have a good one.